Hi, and welcome to Quarantine Cocktails with Chad and Nicole.
Today we'll be talking about the Martinez. So the Martinez is a classic cocktail that is widely regarded as the direct precursor to the martini. The classic recipe is a 1-to-1 ratio of gin and sweet vermouth with a small amount of maraschino liqueur, that's what we're told, that's the way it's pronounced, and a few dashes of bitters.
That's right, and the drink is believed to have originated in San Francisco in the early 1860s at the Occidental Hotel, where commuters were said to sip on them while they were waiting for the ferry home to the East Bay town of Martinez.
So this is also the time when Jerry Thomas, the rock star mixologist of the 19th century, worked there, and he may have in fact been the drink's inventor. So the 1887 reprint of his seminal cocktail book, How to Mix Drinks, contains the version of the drink which is a direct inspiration for today's Martinez, and is also the one that has said to have been led to the martini drink itself.
Yes, there is one earlier published version of the cocktail in O.H. Byron's 1884 book, Modern Bartender's Guide, whose recipe calls for Curacao and Angostura bitters instead of Thomas's use of the maraschino and Boker's bitters. Interestingly, Byron's book presents the Martinez as a Manhattan variation using gin instead of whiskey. And the sweet Martinez is closer in flavor to the Manhattan than it is to the modern martini.
So now we've talked a lot about gin in our series, but we haven't really discussed much of the history of gin itself. So in medieval times, Italian monks made a malt wine beverage infused with juniper, and this spread through various parts of Europe. So in the Netherlands, this concoction caught on and was called Jenever, spelled with a G or a J, which comes from the Dutch word for juniper. By 1600, there were hundreds of Jenever distilleries in Amsterdam alone.
So English soldiers who were in the Netherlands during the 30 Years' War in the early part of the 1600s took Jenever back to England when the war ended around 1648. And the name Jenever was anglicized and shortened to gin. Then it sort of evolved separately in England from the Jenever in the Netherlands, which is still heavily produced and drunk there today.
So gin became widespread across England after the Glorious Revolution in 1688. When William of Orange from the Netherlands himself imposed heavy taxes on imported spirits. So the first third of the 1700s was known as the gin craze, as thousands of gin shops sprung up all across England.
Yeah, so during this period, excessive gin drinking became a major social scourge in England. And the government passed a series of restrictive laws to tax and regulate the spirits consumption and production over the first half of the 1700s. The Gin Act of 1736, for example, imposed really high taxes that essentially resulted in rioting across England.
So the gin at the time was produced in pot stills and became known as Old Tom Gin. This moniker is said to have come from the practice of marking illegal gin purveyors with wooden plaques shaped like a black cat or an old tomcat. The plaques were used to mark a spot where a passerby could drop a coin in a slot and receive a shot of gin through a lead tube poured by the bartender inside. That must have been quite a sight to see.
That's right. So other older cocktails from the 1800s that used gin, such as the Tom Collins, probably also originally used Old Tom gin. The dry London style of gin didn't emerge until the later half of the 1800s, after the invention of the column still in 1830, but really it didn't take off till later. So London gin became the dominant form of gin, and the Old Tom style faded away, but not before it was memorialized in some of these early cocktail books.
So renewed interest in cocktail history has brought back the Old Tom gin, which is considered the missing link between the sweeter Jenever that we just discussed and drier London gin. So there was some Old Tom producers that are around today, including Ransom in Oregon, which has attempted to bring back the traditional form of Old Tom gin.
And this is the gin that we'll be using for today's demo. So we won't dig too much into maraschino or bitters because we've discussed those fairly extensively before in our Manhattan Redux episode and in our Old Fashioned episode. But we did want to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the history of vermouth.
So vermouth is a fortified wine drink infused with botanicals to provide a really rich flavor. The name comes from the French pronunciation of the German word for wormwood, interestingly enough, which is vermouth. And early forms of vermouth were essentially fortified wine with wormwood, which was believed to have medicinal properties. So note the wormwood is also a key ingredient in absinthe, so you've probably heard of it there.
Yeah, which we talked about in our Sazerac episode. So these wormwood wine products were produced in Germany and Italy in the 1500s, and an Italian merchant by the name of D'Alessio, which is a brand of vermouth that's still around today, was in Piedmont, and he was known to have added a number of other botanical products into his vermouth. Soon there were other competing producers in eastern France, and by the mid-1600s, the drink had made its way to England and acquired the anglicized name vermouth.
So modern vermouth can still be traced back to the introduction of sweet vermouth by the Italian merchant Antonio Benedetto Carpano, if that name rings a bell, in Torino in 1786. His vermouth proved so popular that soon his shop was open 24 hours a day, and also soon was a hit with the local royal court located in Turin.
Yeah. At the time, it was the Kingdom of Savoy, but that later got incorporated into partly in France and partly into Italy. France, Italy, and Spain. And modern day dry vermouth is traced to 1813, when Joseph Noilly introduced his pale dry vermouth in France. And in the late 1800s, sweet vermouth was often called Italian vermouth, and dry vermouth called French vermouth, as that's primarily what was produced in each country.
So France, Italy, Spain, they all have very strong traditions of drinking vermouth as an aperitif, while here in the United States, we generally only view it as a cocktail ingredient, interestingly enough. So vermouth kind of got a bad name, a bad reputation in the 20th century in the United States, as we discussed in the Martini episode, but is now having a resurgence as better vermouth has become more widely available.
Yes, and it's important to note that since vermouth is a wine product and is generally around 18-20% alcohol, it's important to store it properly once you've opened it, either by refrigerating it or using a vacuum sealer to keep it from oxidizing further and kind of losing its flavor. And a lot of people's complaints about vermouth may have to do with kind of keeping vermouth around and improperly stored. So please go and store your vermouth properly.
All right, let's do the demo.
All right. So today we're going to be producing a version of the Martinez that I'm calling the Distinguished Martinez. I was originally going to call it the Old Martinez, but I was told that distinguished was a good synonym for old. So we will be using the Ransom Old Tom gin, as we talked about. And for a little twist, we'll also be using some sweet vermouth and some dry vermouth. And some of the Martinez recipes call for this. And it kind of, by splitting it, you get a little bit of kind of a little drier experience. It is a pretty sweet cocktail. So I think this actually produces a nice balance and gives us an opportunity to use two Carpano vermouths, the original and ancient formula, and also their newer dry vermouth, which is from the 20th century, I believe. We'll have the maraschino, and then we'll also be using some bitters, and we'll hark back to Jerry Thomas by using the Bitter Truth, Jerry Thomas's own decanter bitters, which we've also featured before in our Old Fashioned episode, I believe. I liked it so much I went from the sampler size to getting a full large bottle, but you can also get that in a sampler form. And then I'll also be using the Bitter Truth's orange bitters for a mix of those two bitters in the drink. It's kind of, we'll take a little bit of an orange turn with it, with that, and using an orange peel garnish. All right.
Great.
So if you want to get out the glasses and the ice, and I'll start mixing the booze. So
we almost always pre-chill our glasses.
That's right. Nice to keep the glasses chilled.
It keeps the cocktail structured longer.
Yep. Temperature is really important.
So you're adding the...
So I'm adding the Old Tom gin.
And here's the recipe up close for a second, so you can see it. He's adding the Old Tom gin. Now he's adding the
Maraschino.
maraschino.
And I'm using half an ounce because we're making two at a time here. I'll put in 2 ounces of the Carpano.
The Carpano Antica,
which is the sweet vermouth. And there you can see this lovely old-timey label. And then the dry. So this is the Carpano dry. So, you know, now not all dry vermouth comes from France. All the producers make both at this point, or most of them do. So there's the Carpano dry, and then lastly we have our bitters. And since we're doing 2 dashes of each to make 2, that means I will use a 1/4 teaspoon, which is what I use as my reference for 2 dashes. So don't skimp on the bitters. It's pretty important to get enough bitters in there to really add a lot of flavor to the drink. And most people go too light on the bitters, just doing a single dash from the dropper, and that is not sufficient. So there we go.
And we won't be adding saline to this mixture because it's all spirit based.
Right, so we're stirring. It's all spirit based. Some people do call for using saline in almost every cocktail, but we tend to use it for the citrus ones. So we won't be doing that today. We'll take our ice. This is ice straight out of the freezer, so it's cold, but not as wet as bar ice. So we're gonna need to stir a little bit longer than you might expect in order to achieve the right level of dilution. Because, you know, the important part of using the ice is not just about getting to the right temperature, but also achieving dilution that takes some of the bite and edge off of the alcohol and allows some of the botanicals that are in there to kind of release their flavor and come to the forefront, so you get a nice flavorful experience.
Dilution is quite important.
Yep, absolutely.
Something that you really need to pay attention to.
Yep.
From what we've learned.
Yep, and so, you know, when you're using the freezer ice, you gotta stir quite a bit longer for that dilution to really kick in.
I'll show these 2 little Nick and Nora glasses that we got.
Right.
We love them. They're a perfect size.
Yep, so these glasses will hold about 4.5 to 5 ounces, and that's about where I want this drink to end up. It starts out at 3 1/4 roughly,
and then
but by the dilution, it should almost fully fill the Nick and Nora up. All right.
Looks nice.
We'll
So
show
how are
you
we
the
going
fill,
to...
and then we've got to finish it by garnishing it. And we're going to use our orange peel. Just use a nice sharp OXO Y peeler. I'll run it, hold it against the skin. I try not to go too deep. Really just want a nice slice that doesn't get too much of the pith at all. So you get a nice slice like that. Make a second one for you, my dear.
Thank you.
All right. So you
smells
take
good.
that, and then you want to take that one there. Okay.
And we've said this before, but freshly peeled citrus makes such a big difference.
Yep. So you're going to try to express the oils out of it onto the top of the cocktail and around the edge of the glass. Sometimes you can just run it around the edge. And then for a little bit of flair, I like to, clean up my garnish sometimes, clean up the edges with a sharp knife, but sometimes just put a little cut through the center so I can rest it on the side nicely for a little bit of eye candy.
Looks great.
All right, so
you still get the
and you get some of the orange
and
notes.
it's not floating in your drink.
Not floating too much, and without the pith, so it shouldn't be adding to the bitterness of the drink if it does get in there a little bit.
And you can see the fill. We fill them pretty close to the edge.
Yep, so that's the effect of the dilution, which means that these cocktails should be just about perfect. So enjoy your distinguished Martinez or whatever version of the Martinez you've made at home. Cheers, and thanks for joining us. Join us next week for our next exciting episode on the mojito.
Ooh.
Good one. Cheers.